90% of those species have survived. I dealt with Scandinavia. I have to hurry up. So now, Britain I dealt with. By Britain I meant the whole of Britain. Obviously, the more it was England and the more it was the south of England, the more pieces shall there be, because more people actually wore suits and the more the population was concentrated. In Ireland, independent Ireland, I guess the situation was also similar to Britain. In France, the situation was similar to a certain degree. France, until today, is the country in Western Europe, and maybe the whole of Europe, but I think at least for Western Europe, which produces most, take all of the food produced and consumed by the French people today. Today, it is the country that eats most of its local food. In other words, they eat, I think, 40% of all the food is not imported from other countries but from France. Until the 1960s, I think it was a huge number, like 80-90%. In 1990, it was at least 90 to 95% of all the food consumed by people was produced in France. All the food consumed, 95% of all the food consumed throughout the French population, which was about 35 million then, give or take, was grown, produced in France. If it was an animal killed and tortured in France, grains, whatever, produced in France. In stark opposite, Britain was the first country beginning in the mid 1760s, was the first country to start importing food from their colonies. By the 1890s, they had no more peasant classes because 90% of all its food, at least 90%, was all imported from faraway places or mostly from their colonies. The situation remains even higher today. That's the reason for which, if Britain would not survive a war, as in if you get it, but starting by 1820-30, most of the food, I think about 70% of the food was actually imported, at least 70% of the grain. That's the reason for which the peasant classes of Britain have not survived. There was no peasantry by 1890. What is a peasant compared to a farmer? Usually peasants are farmers, but most farmers are not peasants. You would tell me, what is the difference? I took a long time understanding. A peasant, it comes from peasants were created in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. Before that, people would recognize as peasants because they tilled the land and mostly grow everything and do everything. In the vast majority of people of the Middle Ages, those people were serfs. In other words, that would translate as indentured servants, in other words, practically a slave. When those people became free, when the feudal system died, and as those people step by step became free, they were known as peasants, which came from the French word paysan. Pays means country, but it did not even mean back then pays as in the whole country, the whole of France or the whole of England. It meant the region, or even a part of the region. They were local to that region since many centuries. Did not really move away from the land, unlike tribes and nomads, and middle classes would move to the cities and usually moved about more. And they would pay in the country people, because without those people the country would have died. They were the ones to take away the trees, take care of the land, take care of the animals, grow the plants, grow the fruits, so on and so forth. Making sure the population had enough food, because back then everything was local. So if you lived in the northern part of Normandy, 90% of all the food you would have consumed or more would have been grown in the northern part of Normandy, and so on and so forth. It was almost all done village by village. It was practically even not sold from one village to another, or only the local villages, only the neighboring villages. That situation remained practically unchanged throughout the whole of Europe until the 50s, as I said, 50s, when the British started changing that. First of all, the British. So by 1800, 1820, 30 max, most of the food eaten by the entire British population, 70% of it precisely, I think, was imported from faraway countries. In other words, no more means for peasants. What became of the peasants? They just shoot them down? Obviously not. Those peasants became a working class, most of them, but a working factory class. In other words, they moved out of the rural areas, and or the rural areas were transformed into cities that became factory places, industrial places, and those ex-peasants who had each of them a unique culture, almost village by village. They had their own culture, or at least region by region, like the northern part of Scotland. If you take England as an example, northern part of Yorkshire had its own culture, different from the northeastern part, then the north part, then the northwestern part, then the south-north part, and so on, and all was divided like so. Step by step, all these people agglomerated all together to certain places, especially London, Manchester, whatever. Those places grew in size, took away from the land that was initially a countryside. They worked in factories or were unemployed. They lost all these unique cultures. So the peasant class was done. There was still a lot of farmers, but these were mostly independent. They might only procure for the village max or mostly for their own accounts. And so those people, they no longer produced the whole thing because they were alone on their own in a few scattered villages, and thus they did not even have the time, enough people to, for example, produce local cloth to then produce local clothing. So because Britain was the most modern, most like-to-day place in terms everything was already mass-produced for most people, which were the working class, already by the 1830s, even if it was mass-produced by hand, or especially by the 1850s. And the few that remained, the few peasants that remained, there was an exodus by the 1870s, even more than moved to the cities. So by 1890, only a few peasants from really backward areas, from really backward villages, remained in the south, especially of Cornwall, because it was near, the culture was practically the same as the north of Britain in France, and in the very north, just before on the borders with Scotland. And this had a few remained in Scotland, especially the south and the north, and I think the northeast, and the same in Wales. But these were microscopic peasant classes that did not represent the vast majority of people. And like in France, where the peasant class, to some extent, they say to survive until today, that is fake. They survive to tell themselves that they are peasants because they are descendants of peasants, but they do not make their own food. Or at least they don't make their own clothing of their own houses, so to me they only count as farmers next. But the peasants in themselves that mostly made their own cloth, like spin their own yarn, loom their own cloth, made their own clothing in their own individual styles per region, and even sometimes per villages, had almost their own way of dialect, almost per village, but especially per region, as I explained, like the northeastern part of northern Brittany, the northwestern part of northern Brittany, and so on. I could go on for ages. All of that died step by step, but by 1890 it was the vast majority of the people were peasants still, or at least lived on farms, unlike in Britain. So very different to Britain. Also, why less surviving city wear has survived, in other words, suits. Because if you were in a city, you would wear a suit even if you were low class, because you would work in a factory, you were meant to wear a suit, or to at least reach there, because in a city you were meant to be in a suit. So even if in the factory you were working in a sewer and had to wear a special uniform, because the time you go from your cheap apartment to the sewer, you still are in the city, you are expected to wear an appropriate, at least, suit, or something that remotely looks like a suit. But the peasants were different. They wore their own type of clothing, and it did, to some extent, it was a suit, but they also wore these shirts. And as I explained in the Gangs of New York videos, compared to a city shirt, it would look like a city shirt of 50 to more years prior. But I specifically know it is not a city shirt because of the material and some details which mark it as a late 19th century peasant shirt. And it was like that for the clothing, mostly for everything, even their coats and all, especially for shirts, but even the hats, everything was way behind and uniquely done like it was never done even back in the past, like early 19th century in the cities. And usually coarser materials and sort of different patterns and all. By 1920, a lot of that culture had died, but a lot of it, most people still lived with still peasants. By 1940, it had completely changed, especially by 1950. And especially in 1960, it was all the reverse what it is today. And by 1975, the last of those people died out. In other words, the last of those people were in the most backward areas of France, in the most backward villages. And the last remaining people of those villages, in other words, the super old people, might still loom their cloth and all, but then there's people eventually, they were 90 years old in 1975, they died, their children had moved to all the more modern villages or even cities, and they're all gone now. To some extent, those people still exist in Switzerland, in some remote mountains, and they still wear to some extent traditional clothing. But again, they do not sell anything on the internet, they do not